Welcome to another video on deep digital transformation. This video I like to focus on the work by Daniel Schmachtenberger, I hope I pronounced that right, who has an interesting view on humanity's phase transition. But let's introduce it by his own words.
I think that the shift that we are on the precipice of is not like the shift from the Dark Ages to the Enlightenment or even the agricultural revolution. It's like more like a shift from single cell to multicellular life. It's like a really deep fundamental shift in the level and type of complexity in the nature of reality that we're talking about.
If the change is this large, how can we actually do anything sensible? How can we approach it in a creative, useful way? And to do that, it's good to have more insight of what these major transitions in evolution are. So, first of all, going from single cell to multicellular isn't the only major transitions. Other examples are going from cellular to from cloning to sexual reproduction, or the shift from the prokaryote to the eukaryote. So those are other major transitions in evolution. Now, the one with going from single cell to multicell is very useful for the transition we are in at the moment. There's more resemblance there because we need to understand how we go from a single conscious being into a collective intelligence and how can we actually start building infrastructure for that. That's the main challenge in these videos on deep digital. If you look at my previous videos, I've been talking about agile platforms and other kind of infrastructures that allows for mediation of the self-organization. So in to well, let's go back to Daniel and see what kind of effect a major transition has.
Lions can't make themselves radically more capable as a predator in a very short period of time, faster than the gazelles can get away, right? If they could eat all the gazelles and then go extinct because they debased the substrate upon which they lived. And so as the great white's getting a little bit faster, the seals are also getting faster, right? The whole system is co-evolving, so there are no radical power asymmetries.
So when do you get this radical power asymmetries? That's what we call exaptation. So the difference is with adaptation. In adaptation, there is an environmental pressure on the species to so that the most fit will survive, right? That's survival of the fittest. And you see that the environment is basically producing the selection for the species to that niche. Now, the species doesn't need to stay in that niche, well, if you're movable, so you could actually end up in a new niche and have features of the previous niche that now suddenly become or obsolete or give you a power asymmetric advantage. And so if you go to, for example, birds, you know, those were dinosaurs, and the dinosaurs they came from had feathers. The feathers were part of the mating selection process and a way to keep warm. So that's the origin of the feathers. But then in a different niche in trees, they actually evolved the features of flying. So it's a very asymmetric thing, and the other creatures in the trees wouldn't have those features, and so they get actually a competitive advantage in evolutionary terms. So that's how you can actually see this asymmetry, this exaptation as a process. It's happening several places in evolution, and it's a very important concept for what we know in innovation. So when it's adapted to technology, that's how you get the whole idea of the design thinking, where you actually understand the system in its niche, describe it on an abstract level, and then you're capable of using it in a different environment. One of the classical examples of exaptation in technology is microwaving. It requires a high radio signal to actually produce that kind of microwave heat. and it is scientists in radios that actually discovered like, hey, maybe we can cook with this. Now, you would never think to use sound for cooking, so that's a clear acceptation. So back to Daniel.
So that's evolution modified by technology. We need something that is neither of those things to be able to take the next step. And one way of talking about it is evolution is an unconscious process, right? It's an algorithmic process of which species survive and reproduce. And it's extremely slow and most things fail. What makes it through, though, has a profound degree of complexity. Design is a much faster process, but we always build things that optimize for some number of functions that we intended it to optimize for, but they affect more things than we intended to optimize, which usually is an externality. There's some, harm where it wasn't intended. Evolution by design is something that is different than just technology design, where we're designing complicated systems, and it's different than complex design that is unconscious.
This is a pretty classical distinction. On the one hand, evolution. On the other hand, conscious design. What you actually see is that if you go way deeper into evolutionary cybernetics, is that you have these designing processes already happening at other levels. Let me clarify. Now, something is artificial if you need energy to produce it. A very clear example, um, we discovered artificial vacuum, but of course up there in the space there's all kind of natural vacuum. Vacuum is more the norm than the exception, but here, because we have this atmosphere, trying to create a vacuum requires energy to get all the gases out. In the same way, everything we create that requires energy, like agriculture, right? You can have a natural landscape, but most of our landscapes are agriculture. So we have produced energy and labor to produce the way it looks now. But that's actually something that evolution has been doing all the time. If you think about emotions, where do you find emotions? Emotions are inside the brain, created by energy the body takes to feed the brain. So emotions are artifacts, artifacts by animals. But going a level deeper, you actually see that by adaptation, there wouldn't be something like a protein, and a protein is like the building block of everything in your body. But if you go to studies on the origin of life, you will see this whole debate about what is called the RNA world, where they try to figure out like what things could have evolved naturally, and the thing is that proteins couldn't. So proteins are artifacts produced by cells. So saying this, you see that design itself is way deeper embodied. Now, I actually disagree even more, because the idea that evolution is unconscious, there is debate today, and that's maybe new. But if you go into the quantum physics world today, you will see that there are bridges being built with biology as well. And but it goes in two directions. First of all, it's the quantum world that actually starts explaining some parts of biology, but there are some of the biology that explain the quantum, and one of them relates to what you could call mind over body. Is that the maybe consciousness as a field is already present, and that's not so strange. I mean, think about gravity. I mean, I have a gravity pull, but it's not that large as this planet, right? Nothing is going to my head because the gravity of the world is of course bigger. And now if you go on lower levels, you will see that it is electromagnetism that is way stronger, and gravity just doesn't play any role anymore. So it is consciousness is an emerging property, and that's the thing. You see that even you can question how conscious is a human being that never got into contact with society. There already you have big challenges. It's very hard to disconnect our consciousness with our culture. So it's way more entwined than that. And the idea that there's like unconscious evolution just doesn't make really a lot of sense. I believe that when we're unraveling the mystery, we are discovering that on lower levels, consciousness is just very different. I'll give a concrete example. In many of these mindfulness exercises, you learn that actually you have something like muscle memory, and you cannot fully understand what it is, but you understand that there's a kind of awareness there, and we don't really communicate with the single cells in our body, but there seems to be ways to better and better listen to these things in our body. So that's that emerging property. It's just like understanding that I have a gravitational pull on lower levels of cognition, of complexity. There is still cognition, but it's just very more rudimentary. Okay, so back to Daniel.
Which we can think of it in mythopoetic terms and say the evolutionary process kept increasing orderly complexity until we got to the capacity for abstraction that could contemplate evolution itself and look at the principles of evolution, see what it's doing, and choose to consciously participate with and mediate evolution itself. And so then we get to we have the possibility of moving from being parts of the whole that are competing with each other, but moving to having power that makes that no longer possible, to actually being agents for the whole. Because we can't model ourselves as apex predators when we have the ability to extinct whole species, ruin whole biospheres, make new species. That's no longer an adequate model. The only thing in nature that has the kind of ubiquitous power that can make species and destroy species and change the geography is nature itself, but now consciously mediated through agents that have kind of woken up as that. So I think this next shift is us realizing that as technology that results from our abstraction, but focused on parts and not focused on how the whole thing fits together. As technology is kind of giving us the power of gods, we have to get the love and wisdom and understanding of gods, or we self-terminate with that power. That's a big task. I don't think that we can say that anything smaller than that could possibly be adequate.
It's interesting to see how now a very clear evolutionary cybernetic perspective is taking on, and it describes the process clearly. And the idea that something godly is going on is actually resonating well with recent publications. So I will put into the link a paper within our research group called Return to Eden, where the question is related to all these godlike features like being omnibenevolent, omnipotent, therefore omnis. Read the paper. It investigates how close we are to such features. The the thing that was missing in the previous part about understanding how design is part of the evolution itself actually may contain part of how we can solve that, because one way I like to describe it is that we moved away from being this apex predator where our prey used to be the scarce resources everywhere, while now our main source of economics is basically innovation. And if you look at innovation, the game is totally different. And if I would actually go to biology to find a kind of environmental niche where you see that behavior, you get to what is called eusocial creatures like ants, termites, or the naked mole rat. That's another example. And they have this very interesting feature, being that it's hard to find the source of food, but once they found the source of food, the source is probably big enough to feed the whole colony. And therefore, you see this shift from being an individual agent to a collective entity. And for me, that's the same thing is happening with our society, where we go from scarce economics to abundance, and because once you have like this unicorn, and the best way is to actually spread it as fast as possible so that everyone can benefit from it. And that stuff are happening. Scarcity is being built in now by legal structures, but that's just like putting the brake on while trying to go faster. So you see that we can learn a lot about that kind of behavior, and we are actually learning a lot in going from scarce resources to abundant resources. That seems to be one of this major transition is about, and I really like the metaphor Daniel is using with the caterpillar. So
when we think about the kind of caterpillar to butterfly metamorphosis, inside the chrysalis, it's not a caterpillar or a butterfly, it's goo, right? And that goo phase, that liminal phase, the caterpillar is actually dying, right? Because the caterpillar doesn't just lose weight and grow wings. If you look at it, the caterpillar has a genetic code to go gather parts, right? To gather minerals and amino acids and sugars that are going to then be reassembled into a butterfly. If we were just looking at the caterpillar and we didn't know it was going to butterfly and we were looking at it's getting bigger and it's eating everything and it's not pollinating anything, we would predict that it eats itself into extinction. Except at a certain point, it gets rich enough blood chemistry that it triggers this movement into the chrysalis. It starts to dissolve. It gets reorganized at a amino acid level into something that now pollinates the plants that the caterpillar decimated across these vast spaces and helps the evolution of the whole system. The butterfly phase could not have been predicted from the caterpillar phase. So if we look at capitalism and the military-industrial complex and all those systems as gathering parts, right? Very much like the caterpillar was, net consumption, very much like a fetus is in utero. The fetus couldn't go past 40 weeks, 50, 60, it dies and the mom dies. But it also couldn't come out much earlier because it wasn't ready to make a phase shift. It comes out when it first can. It has finally evolved to the place that it can actually do breast milk rather than get food from the umbilical cord directly. But it also comes out when it has to. There's a fairly narrow window of transition. The same is true for an animal developing inside of an eggshell, right? There's a finite amount of resources, and when it runs out, it has to emerge, but that's also the first time that it can emerge, that its system can handle the transition. So we see in nature this kind of precedent that these discrete nonlinear phase shifts, because there's a curve of in utero, and then there's a shift, and then there's a curve outside, but that discrete phase shift of come through the birth canal is different than either the phase before or after.
I like the fact that we are in this phase transition, and we're going from one side, and then there's a shift, and we'll end up over here doing something very different. Now, it's for me, it resonates with the whole idea of, on the one hand, technological singularity connected to the concept of the global brain or the Gaia hypothesis there, is that humanity is this evolutionary phase transition from animals to something new, and this is, so that's the meta system transition, and it may actually be a huge transition that's already been going on for 10,000 years. The moment we start really creating society tools, have our agricultural evolution. And you need to see that agricultural evolution was only possible because the niches were rich enough to allow it. And now we see all this technological accelerating going on. I believe we are at the moment that it's going to be stabilizing and not to grow exponential anymore, because I think that what is considered the singularity, which is in 20 years, is actually the midpoint of a huge S curve. And to get actually somewhere our heads around that idea, I've created a few years ago a video on global brain embodiment, where I'm trying to explain that this evolution of cities is actually, you could actually see it from a larger evolutionary perspective. So maybe it's a good point to actually round up. It's a very high level view. I just really like the things I'm learning about sense making. I will also add some links because I find all this kind of information thanks to Rebel Wisdom. It's a good channel, so I'll add a little bit links over there. And well, okay. Hope you enjoyed this video.